So, I recently hit Challenger in my second set of TFT, and in this video I'm going to be showing you 10 things that I learned along the way that you can apply to your own climb. And a disclaimer is that this video is tailored towards higher elo players, mainly those in Diamond or above. If you're a beginner to TFT, then there's heaps of other videos out there introducing basic concepts, including one of my previous videos on this channel. Keeping your mental strong is important in climbing any competitive game. However, specifically tailored towards TFT, you need to be respecting the hands that you've been given and play accordingly. What I mean by this is that if you've been given a really shitty opener and then you roll down at 6 or 7 and still hit nothing, then you're likely playing for a top 6. And if you do get that 6, it's important not to tilt that you had bad hands and that you had a bad opener, but it's important to reflect on the game, think about the small mistakes that you've made, and be grateful that at least you got that 6 rather than an 8th. And of course the reverse is true. If you high roll, it's important not to be content with a second when you know that you could have gotten a first if you played it better. Fixing small mistakes here and there goes a long way, especially when trying to climb in the really higher elos. Knowing when you're playing for a top 6 is usually pretty easy because it's generally just when you're low rolling. However, the more difficult skill that needs to be developed is how to play for a top 6. Generally this means aggressively leveling and rolling down at earlier levels in order to conserve as much HP as possible so that in the late game you're only bleeding out slowly. So the key takeaway from this point is that you need to respect the position that you're in, and sometimes you're just playing for a 6 when your game is looking like an 8th. The difference between Challenger and Master players is the consistency in being able to do this. Not always worrying about going first, instead playing the hands that you've been given and being able to consistently turn those 8ths into 6s and those 6s into 4ths. Previously I thought that slamming items was just always better unless the item that you're greeting for is best in slot. However, now I think about it differently. I actually heard this from BoxBox, but the way that he thinks about items is that items are a tool used to conserve HP. And the way you need to think about it is that if you slam this item now early into the game, think about how much HP it would save you over the course of say 10 rounds that it's been played in. Whereas if you greed the item and yes you get a best in slot item later into the game, sure it might save you twice as much HP, but if you're only using it for a third of the game, then it's actually going to be worse than had you slammed the other suboptimal item in the first place. The way he words it is that slamming a 5 out of 10 item at the start of a game is about equal to making a 10 out of 10 item halfway down later into the game. And generally when I think about it this way, you're almost always going to get more value out of slamming the item earlier than if you were to greed it. Of course it's a skill that takes a long time to develop, but consciously thinking about it will make you a much better player. Also, I've heard a lot of Challenger players disagree with the idea of best in slot, as generally speaking, it's better to slam items and get value out of them earlier, which is why I recommend sites like lolchess.gg, as they show up to 5 items on each champion, as generally speaking, it's better to get more value in the earlier stages than to greed for best in slot. Of course, if you were a perfect player, then playing flexibly would be the best way to play, no argument. However, keep in mind that because we're not perfect, we often make a lot of mistakes with decision making, so which makes one-tricking all that more viable. Personally, I made my final push from Grandmaster to Challenger one-tricking jacks. This is because I know the comp well, and it's still meta enough for me to be able to force it. Of course, there's a few other comps that I'm comfortable playing with if I get a good opener for them. However, having that one comp to fall back to makes it really good because when you roll down at level 8, you don't have to think as much about the units you're going to play as you've already done it multiple times. The only time that I really took 8s in my climb was when I tried to pivot into a comp that I wasn't familiar with. And even though sometimes my items for jacks would be bad, still forcing it and coming 5th or 6th was always better than trying to pivot into a comp I didn't know how to play, and usually I would go 8th or 7th. When you stick to a small pool of comps, you learn the ins and outs, and it's the smallest differences that will cost you the most HP in the long run. You don't have to one trick and force something exactly, but I would recommend playing no more than 3 comps when you're trying to climb in really high elo. And if you don't know what comps are meta right now, I'd highly recommend watching Twitch or checking out sites like lolchess.gg and going into the meta comps tab. Under here you can find out what comps people are playing, and this is updated every 24 hours, which means that even if a new patch comes out, you can see what the high elo players are playing. In TFT, especially when you plateau, you learn a lot more by watching others than by playing games yourself. I'd recommend Twitch over YouTube, mainly because YouTube videos are usually high roll and you don't learn as much from them, as well as the fact that with Twitch you can ask questions and get live feedback depending on the game state. and I'd highly recommend that you watch those with lower view count but high elo, as they're more likely to respond to your questions. I personally like watching any challenger player who has less than 100 viewers, as they'll pretty much answer all of your questions. The main thing to take away is of course the decision making and thought process of the streamer. However, something that's really underrated is simple rules that you can learn only by watching other streamers. Of course, the rules will change from patch to patch, so it's important to stay updated, but a few rules that I've picked up from watching others play is that I never play ranges early, 6 skirmisher is a fake trait, and when you get a Nico opener, usually you want to roll down at 7 so that you can hit a 4 cost 2 star using that Nico to get tempo. There's a few reroll comps where you need to open fort or econ early. However, for the majority of your games, you're going to want to be playing in order to preserve as much HP as possible. The higher the elo, the closer the HP of players when you get to late game. I've even had games where 1st through to 8th have a difference of sub 20 HP, which means that had you conserved an extra 10 HP earlier, this could mean the difference between an 8th and a 5th. Later into the game, you lose more HP, so lose streaking in stage 2 if you have a really bad opener is definitely acceptable, and even in stage 3. However, you need to be a little bit careful because if you're getting 4-0'd in every single round of stage 2 and then you lose streak stage 3 as well, you're going to be in a really bad spot. What I do pretty much every single game is level to 4 so that my stage 2 is pretty decent, aggressively level to 5, and then I'm leveling to 6 all while staying under 40 gold. In high elo, you can pretty much never have 50 gold unless you know that you're about to roll down in 1 to 2 turns. There's not too much you can do about beefing up your board in the early game if you just simply low roll. However, when you get to level 6, if you have a decent amount of pairs and you're getting absolutely destroyed, it's a really good idea to roll down then. However, generally what I try and do is make it to level 7 with a decent amount of HP and then roll down for a board which will take me to level 8. It's really greedy to hold on to 50 gold at level 7 and try and get to level 8 that way, as often you can have high roll games where you're 100 HP at level 7, but if you have a bunch of 1-star item holders, then there's a good chance you're going to lose 40 HP in the next 3 turns. HP is a resource worth much more than gold, so don't be greedy with your gold and sit on 50 when only a couple of rolls could make your board that much stronger in order to preserve HP. The main difference I found between Masters and Grandmasters players is that Masters players will greed their econ and try and sit at 50 when they really shouldn't. The strategy of preserving econ and going fast 8 only works when you're high rolling, so it's much better to roll down at 6 and or 7 if you need to. Your strongest board will almost always consist of a good mix of frontline, backline, and utility. A common mistake that I see all the time, even in high elo, is that players will pick up too many offensive items and then their team simply lacks utility and defense. For example, with my skirmisher tech that I run in most games, skirmishers naturally stack AD, which means that they don't actually need offensive items in the early game, which is why I usually start Belt, because it allows you to make Sunfire Cape or Redemption, which is a really good defensive item allowing you to streak early. In my opinion, Sentinel Skirmisher opener with Sunfire is the best opener you can get currently. The Jax comp, you don't need as much utility because Jax is a lot more tanky than other carries. However, if you're running backline units such as Draven or Aphelios, getting utility items such as Trap Claw is extremely important in order to keep him safe from any Thresh hooks or Viego ults. Of course, there's thousands of examples that I could go into. However, just when you're playing TFT and you're playing your strongest board, think about what your champion's traits do, and then think about what items you need to make in order to compensate for the lack of one of the 3. Especially now, because 3-star 3 costs is so meta right now, you need to be scouting to see what other people are playing so that you're not contested. Of course you can play contested, it just means that it's a lot harder to hit your 3 stars, which is usually pretty vital in certain comps. For example, 2 comps which are really easy to run for me are 3-star Yasuo and 3-star Nocturne. However, if I get dropped them early, I'll only consider playing them if no one else is playing them. From my experience, contesting a 3-star comp is a complete coin flip, as usually one of the 2 will hit and the other one will go bot 4. Which is why I try not to slam those Yasuo items until I know that no one else is playing them. There's almost no time in the game where scouting is not beneficial, so getting better at it is a skill that needs to be developed if you're going to make it to high elo. If you're lose streaking, it's extremely important to scout to make sure that your board is weaker than all of the other boards, because if you break a lose streak, especially if it's a large one, then you're going to lose a lot of gold. And on the contrary, if you're trying to win streak, make sure to scout out the stronger boards, just to make sure that you're strong enough to beat them and keep your streak, otherwise you might want to consider leveling. In the early game, I always try and have a diagonal line like this. This is because Kha'Zix can pick off your backlines if they're isolated. However, with this formation, instead all of the carries will turn on Kha'Zix and kill him. In the mid game, I'm usually scouting for Nunus and Nocturnes, as you want to position in the opposite corner of Nocturne, and you want to make sure that if you have a frontline carry, you don't want them to be getting one shot by a Warmog's Nunu. Another thing to note is that I'm running my knights on the edges for a very specific purpose. This is because due to pathing, if their enemy has backline units, the Thresh and the Nautilus will tend to get targeted first, which would give my Aurelia and Lee Sin more time to scale up and do more damage. As well as the fact that Yasuo has a higher DPS than Thresh, I want Thresh to die first before my Yasuo. In the late game, there's a lot more units on the board as well as more items, so you need to be thinking about more things at once. The main three things on my mind are usually Shrouds, Zephyrs, and Viegos, both mine and the opponent's. If your Jax gets Viego'd in a Jax carry comp, then it's pretty much a guaranteed loss, whereas if your Viego hits one of their carries, then it's a pretty much guaranteed win. In this specific example, you can see that I need to bait out the Vel'Koz's damage so that my Jax has time to scale. As you can see here, I have a redemption to give to Jax, which means that the AoE damage from Vel'Koz will be nullified, as well as the fact that my Galio is positioned on the right side, which baits out a Vel'Koz ult and it doesn't even kill him. And because my Viego is working left to right, I position my Thresh on the right side so that he never hooks Zyra, and as you can see here, he cancels the second Vel'Koz ult. This is actually a really hard matchup because of the Spellweaver Fiddlesticks, however because of all the small positioning advantages, it gave my Kayle enough time to finish off the win. Of course, I can't go into every single champion and how to position them perfectly against other champions, but this clip just goes to show how you can position several different units and get slight advantages which result in a first over a third. In TFT, the items you can get from the neutral camps comes from an item pool, which doesn't include items you select from Armory or from Carousel. This means that if you start the game with a bow and you don't get any bows in the early neutral rounds, it means that there's a good chance that you'll still get a bow later into the game. However, if you start the game with a sword and you get 2 bows from your first 2 camps, then there's a very low chance that you're going to get another bow later into the game. With this in mind, it's important that you select the right items at Carousel and in the armories. For example, with the Jax comp, sure you want a sword for BT, but you don't really want too many other swords, so I never start sword on the Carousel. What's better in fact is to start something like a belt, because belt can be used to create lots of different items which can be utilized in the Jax comp. It's for this reason that when you're playing certain comps, you want to make sure that you're selecting items at the armory and carousels that you'd be fine to create multiple different items from that half item. It's different for every comp and you need to think about it in the long run. For example, if I was to start belt and I'm trying to play a Jax comp, then sure, maybe 10% of games I can't get a sword in order to get BT. However, if I started sword, then I'd say that at least 40% of games I'd probably be stuck with an extra sword that I don't want. So in the long run, even though I'm not getting my Jax items straight away, it's better to get an item which is more flexible rather than just going for the best in slot items straight away. Also, going back to my point of having a good mix between utility, defense, and offense, if you're getting too many defensive components, then it's important to pick up offensive items and vice versa. Like I said before, greeting for 50 interest gold is almost never the play in high elo TFT. It's simply because you lose too much HP if you're carrying 1 cost units when in fact you should be rolling or leveling in order to get a power spike. Pretty much in all of my games, after Wolves, I'll go 7 and roll down so that my board isn't a complete joke. If I don't at least have a Jax or Galio, then I'll want a 2-star Nidalee or Riven in order to carry me through to level 8. Going to level 8 with 50 interest gold and 1-star carries will cost you way too much HP. And again, in most of my games, I go 8 on Raptors and roll down after that. It's important to note that I only stay 50 gold before the Raptors if I have most of my board already complete, otherwise it's perfectly fine to roll down to 30 gold before. Because rolling down 50 gold and completely pivoting your board in one turn is really difficult, so unless you 100% know exactly the comp that you're going and what you're doing with all your items, then I would recommend rolling down a little bit before. Even you can see here in this roll down, even though I knew exactly what I was doing here, as you can see I've rolled down 50 gold and my Jax is slightly mispositioned and I only get there in the last couple of seconds. Had I missed out on the Jax, then I probably would have just gone 8th this game. And that is the end of this video. Of course, there's going to be times when you're going to go against some of the things that I was saying, but the core concepts that I'm trying to get across in this video need to be practiced in order to reach higher elo. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching this video and subscribe to see more.